This past summer, I was called back to a former congregation that I had the honor of serving to help with a funeral of a 102-year-old woman. 102. So when I was there, she was only in her 80s. And she was a force to be reckoned with. Her name was Betty Stein. And Mrs. Stein was one of the first female presidents of a Reformed congregation in the country. And in addition to that, she was on almost every civic board. She did whatever she could. For hers was the understanding that if Jewish people involved themselves in the community that surrounded them, especially in smaller communities, then the neighbors would care about what happens to the Jews. When I was there, I was in my early 30s, and Mrs. Stein called me on the phone and said, "Rabbi, it's time you got to know the bishop." I was from a big city where interfaith work was not really something that my rabbis did too much of. They had a gazillion families at Temple Flash Dance, and they had to work on those folks, and it was a big city. Then when I was a rabbi in Chicago, the boss said, "If you have time to do interfaith work, then go home and read a book." So I was not really trained for how to respond to this question that Mrs. Stein was asking, and she said to me, "Would you like to come and meet the bishop?" That was not really a question, it was a trap. When Mrs. Stein, especially if she called me rabbi, by the way, if Mrs. Stein said, "Rabbi, would you like to go meet the bishop?" the answer was, "Yes, ma'am." And we, of course, did go meet the bishop. We had a wonderful conversation. And I had a rabbi emeritus at this congregation who was very, very accomplished at interfaith work and community building. And he told me about Bishop Darcy, was his name of blessed memory now. And we had a wonderful experience. It wasn't but a few days later that he called me and he said that a cardinal was coming from the Vatican to come and meet with the Lutherans, but wants to meet with a Jewish representative as well. And you're it. Luckily, he wanted to meet with more than just me, but I reluctantly said yes because he already told Mrs. Stein. So the truth is that why not? Except in the interim between the time I said yes and the time that the cardinal was coming, the statement on the Vatican's understanding of the Holocaust came out, and an unbelievable fury surrounded that statement, and Cardinal Edward Cassidy, you know, the cardinal I'm going to meet with, wrote it. So now I am the least qualified Jew in America to meet with this cardinal, and I am the first rabbi to meet with him since the statement comes out. Oh, for the glory and fame. This is Mrs. Stein. She's the one in the red. If anybody comments on how I looked 25 years ago, you and I are going to have a tussle. Next to me is Cardinal Edward Cassidy, now of blessed memory as well, and John Darcy, who was the Bishop of Fort Wayne for more than 25 years and one of the first bishops to ever come out against priests and some of the abuse that had been happening. He had no tolerance for it at all before anybody cast a lawsuit. These were good men, except for me. The fact is that Mrs. Stein called, and I said, yeah, okay. But what I should have said was Hineini. It says in this week's Torah portion, God put Abraham to the test. He said to him, Abraham, and he answered, here I am, Hineini. And he said, take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you. Now, Mrs. Stein would love that I was calling her like God in this story. But put that aside. Abraham could have said, and I quote, "Say what?" But instead he said, "Hineini, here I am." But listen to this. Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father," and he answered, "Hineini, here I am, my son." So it's not just that God called him, but Isaac called him too. The same answer, Hineini, was found with both father, from Abraham, to God and to his son. He was answerable to both. Made me think a lot about this interaction that I had and my need to be a little bit better about how to say more than just, "Oh yeah, okay, I'll do that," but to actually be present, to say Hineini and mean it, to hear a call for doing good, improving the world, and knowing how to say Hineini, I am here. Now, you and I both know that we have mentors and teachers and parents and spouses, the plural of which is spice, people that we will say yes to in a way that will say yes to no others. They are the Hineini core of our lives. They are the people that we depend on to have our backs when they ask the question, not that we should have their backs in our answer. If they ask us to do something, we're happy to do that. I have been blessed in this particular position to have people who were brought up with the idea of Kibud Harav, honor of the rabbi. And it's the office of rabbi, not the person of rabbi. Where if the rabbi calls, and I especially get a kick out of this when parents say this to their kids, if the rabbi calls you, you say yes. And then you hear what the rabbi wants you to do. And it's been my goal to never, ever abuse that privilege, because there is great joy in having a sense that there are people willing to be involved in the sacred task of our congregation or the work of the Jewish people. And so hearing a call from me responded to with not just, "Okay, Rabbi, if that's what you want," they know they're not doing me a favor. They're working on behalf of the betterment of the Jewish people, or on the betterment of the congregation, or the betterment of themselves. That's one way to respond to Hineini, when somebody calls. But there are other ways too. Like, for example, when people call and there's nobody to hear. Or when you hear the call and there was really nobody calling. But it's that still small voice outside of you that says, do the right thing. For some of us who engage in Torah study, eventually we start to hear God's voice through the way the Torah quotes itself in our heads. So some people think that that's just, okay, you're just going crazy. But other people understand that to be the way you affect your conscience to hear God's voice in a way that has you do the right thing, not just because it's the right thing for you. You had to have learned that somewhere, but because you're hearing it as God's call. And when you hear it, it doesn't mean that somebody has to say it. It just means that you have to hear it, but you still have to respond with the concept, Hineini, I am here. For if you do not, then what's left? Selfishness. Sometimes that selfless moment where you know that doing good, being better, helping will not get you anything more than the satisfaction of knowing that you did the right thing at the right time in the right place. Such was true when, eventually you might be able to see this, such was true after the Pittsburgh bombing. The Pittsburgh bombing was one of the more challenging times I can ever remember as a rabbi since I was ordained. People didn't know if they should be afraid to come to temple or if they should come to temple in Mass. And we had a show-up Shabbat that was preceded, however, by this card from the neighbors of the temple, who made it clear that we are welcome in this neighborhood, who made it clear that it wasn't going to be in their backyard. They heard a gunshot, and they responded with Hineini to show us that we were not alone. That was something. That was something. But when you and I respond with helping the hungry, taking a minute and giving $1 to somebody who's on the corner at the stoplight that we're at, not because we're convinced that they're going to buy booze, but because we're convinced that our dollar is going to help them in a way that not having it won't. When we do the kinds of things that help the needy and honor the stranger and do the kinds of things that our tradition teaches us at its core, that's a way to respond with Hineini. But Mrs. Stein's moment with me all those years ago created for me a need to do something more. And after Pittsburgh, I also felt like I needed to respond with Hineini. It was a call, to be sure, a call that I should have been responding to for years before it. Our congregation started a listening time where we were listening to others, and as we were listening to others in the congregation, we were developing a social action plan for our congregation. It includes, but is not limited to, some interfaith work, where we are going to have an opportunity at the end of, beginning of November, on a Sunday night in November, to meet with members of a couple of the churches in Wyoming, to hear from each other about what's keeping everybody up at night. Not because we want to agree, but because we want to hear each other. We want to listen, but we also want to hear. We don't have to agree. We don't have to have the argument that brings us to consensus, which, by the way, is not a majority, it's everybody. Consensus is everybody. But what we need to do is remember that cards like this sometimes come out of the goodness of people's hearts. But I'd rather it come out of the relationship that we all have with each other. I got a beautiful email this morning. Sorry, I checked my email this morning. From Chaplain Copeland from the place where Marty and Helen lived, Maple Knoll up the street. He said, I remember you sent me a Merry Christmas greeting, and I figured I should send you a L'Shana Tova greeting. I don't think he said L'Shana Tova. That's the relationship I want. I want us to be in each other's lives without having to be each other's faith. And I want us to respond Hineini to the needs of our neighbors, so that if, God forbid, we need our neighbors to respond Hineini, they will want to, not just be compelled to. There are many things that you all do, just like Mrs. Stein did, to make the world a better place, because you hear God's call all the time in all kinds of ways. And for that, I am grateful as a citizen of the world, as your rabbi, and as your friend. But you and I both know that not all of us do that enough. Not all of us are looking for the opportunities to say Hineini. Not all of us are looking for the opportunities to figure out how we can make this world a better place. And to know that God doesn't ask us to do things that are horribly immoral, like what could have been with the binding of Isaac. Instead, the binding of Isaac is that story that tells us that God doesn't call us to kill children, especially our own. When those voices are heard, that's not the still small voice. That's a voice that needs some medication. That's a voice that isn't God. That's the voice of evil. God's voice is the one that we freely and easily say Hineini to, unless we're too selfish to be able to do it. And when we do, the community that we build is filled with joy and gladness. And when it's not filled with joy and gladness, it's filled with the warmth of friendship, the warmth of community, in a way that people who know each other, who listen to each other, who care about each other, have. So look for the next time to say Hineini and respond. L'shana tova.